Welcome back to chessopenings.com. In today's video, we'll take a look at the Scandinavian Opening, which begins with the moves pawn to e4 and pawn to d5. With the move pawn to d5, black immediately challenges white's central pawn on e4 and also creates opportunities for his light-squared bishop to get developed. In most cases as well, black will have an opportunity to bring his queen to a somewhat active post. On the flip side, white has no real difficulty in grabbing a quick and early development advantage, and also, even though white finds it necessary to trade off his e-pawn early in the game, he often experiences no real difficulty in placing his d-pawn on the fourth rank. We'll get a chance to ponder all of the implications of these small strategic nuances today. Let's take a look. Black's move, pawn to d5, kicks off the Scandinavian defense. White's almost universal reply is pawn takes pawn on d5. Now black has two ways to go about recovering the pawn. The main method is simply to play queen takes d5, leaving the queen vulnerable to the move knight to c3, which is in fact often played and does gain some time for white's development. Nevertheless, black gains a somewhat active square for the queen, either by queen a5 or the recently common and interesting move, queen to d6. Black may also argue that despite his losing a tempo in replying to knight to c3, the knight may be placed just a little bit clumsily. Ideally, white would have preferred to play the moves pawn to d4 and pawn to c4 prior to playing the move knight to c3. But let's back up for a moment and take a look at another possibility for black, which begins with the move knight to f6. With the alternative treatment of knight f6, black aims to recapture the pawn with the knight. One of the attractive features of this move is that if white tries to hold onto the pawn with the move pawn to c4, this opens the way for a potential gambit with the move pawn to e6, pawn takes pawn, and bishop takes e6, whereupon the development of the bishop on e6 and the knight on f6 gives quite a bit of compensation for the pawn and excellent attacking chances. Another possibility for black would also be to play pawn to c6, which also leads to a fair game. But white does not need to hang on to the pawn fiercely in this manner. Instead, it is quite possible for him to continue more quietly with the move pawn to d4, and this has been shown to be quite an effective approach. After black's planned recapture, knight takes d5, white only now plays the move pawn to c4, this time simply gaining time at the knight's expense. After the frequent moves, knight to b6 and knight f3, it is true that black has created some new options for himself due to the knight's journey to b6. For example, a common approach here is pawn to g6, making use of the bishop's free scope along the diagonal to pressure the center and develop the pieces in a more imbalanced way. However, white's central space and the knight's awkward placement on b6 often allow white to seize a significant advantage out of the opening. Thus, from black's point of view, the most solid move is queen takes pawn on d5. And now white normally continues knight c3, gaining a juicy tempo at the queen's expense. And at this moment, black has two options about where to place the queen. The most traditional move has been queen a5 over time, but another recently popular idea is also queen to d6. We'll spend the video today looking at queen a5, which is the most traditional and still most popular approach in this position. White now continues pawn to d4. While it is evident that white has a little extra space in the center, it may be difficult to understand at first glance how white can make any use of this. Black has no real weaknesses in his position, and as we'll see in a moment, he doesn't experience too many problems in developing his pieces. However, the centralized pawn on d4 does confer white some important benefits. In the first place, black's e-pawn is deprived of its most attractive location on the e5 square. Though the move pawn to e5 would be in the same spirit as the initial move of the Scandinavian pawn to d5, here black simply doesn't have enough time, and white would have a significant advantage after either pawn takes pawn on e5 or the even stronger move knight to f3. After the standard developing moves, knight to f6 and knight to f3, black can no longer dream about bringing a pawn to the e5 square. At the same time, the pawn on d4 helps to create an outpost for the knight on the e5 square. This will come in handy as the knight itself will be helpful in gaining some attacking chances, and also by releasing the f-pawn, which is behind the knight currently, the kingside pawn majority will also gain some flexibility at a later stage in the game. Another way that white tends to gain an upper hand in the Scandinavian is by sometimes capturing the bishops which black finds active squares for at a later stage. This is a common occurrence in the openings for black, that quite frequently when he finds active squares for his bishops, he may find that they are also vulnerable. For black's part, he will simply want to continue his development. Play normally continues with the move pawn to c6, and this is a solid move which has among its purposes the creation of flight squares for the queen. It is quite typical to find the queen needing the insertion of the move c7 to c6, since later, after white plays the move bishop to d2, the queen may find herself needing the flight squares either on c7 or d8. And now white's follow-up of choice here has been the move bishop to c4. Since white knows that the mobility of his kingside pawns may later play a role, he often ensures that his development scheme supports him in castling his king on the queen side. This is one reason to move the bishop to c4, leaving the e2 square as an attractive square for the queen. The bishop also makes an important contribution in attacking along the a2 to g8 diagonal, which will be felt over the next several moves. From here, ordinarily black plays the move bishop to f5. It may appear tempting to try the move bishop to g4 instead, but here practice indicates that white gains an advantage by gaining the bishop pair. He does this by means of playing h3, bishop h5, pawn to g4, bishop to g6, and then knight to e5, and capturing the bishop over the next few moves. In this position, since white is very likely to castle onto the queen side, the movement of the kingside pawns is actually quite legitimate and may even constitute a gain of time if white expands the pawns forward at a later time. And by the way, it may appear that after the move bishop to g4, white has the tactic bishop takes f7 check, king takes f7, and now knight to e5 check. But here, white would be in for a rude awakening after the move queen takes e5 check, pawn takes queen, and bishop takes queen on d1, when despite the fact that white has two pieces available for capture, he will still remain down a piece. Thus, instead of bishop g4, bishop f5 is a bit more logical and has been played more frequently. Play continues naturally with the move bishop to d2, and while it's true that the bishop is now eyeing the queen for a discovery attack, as of yet, white doesn't have any particularly powerful method of exploiting this fact. Therefore, the move e6 has been played, simply continuing to develop by opening the way for the f8 bishop. In cases where black has modestly retreated the queen to c7 instead, white has typically used the extra time to again pursue the bishop pair and extra space with the move knight e5, which attacks the f7, pawn to e6, g4, bishop g6, and now often the move pawn to h4 with an advantage. Thus, the move pawn to e6 not only contributes to black's development, but it also blunts the bishop's trajectory on c4 and thereby solidifies black's position. There follows now the move queen to e2, preparing the way for queenside castling. From here, it is quite common for play to continue bishop to b4, when after castling queenside, white often eventually plays a2 to a3, netting the bishop pair and maintaining an opening initiative. The move queen e2 contains a hidden threat as well. If white was able to violate the rules of the game and move a second time consecutively, he would then have the excellent tactical shot pawn to d5, when right away the dog pile on the e6 pawn has serious consequences immediately. If black is willing to play c takes d5, it appears that he's escaped most of the difficulty, but in fact, after the simple move bishop to b5 check, there's no healthy way for black to deal with this simple check. If he plays the move knight to c6, white would then play knight to d4, attacking both the knight on c6 and also the bishop on f5 due to the pin given by the queen. And after the natural move, castling queenside, which appears to handle both threats effectively, white would simply win material with bishop takes c6, b takes c6, and knight takes c6, forking both the queen and the rook. Another attempt, in place of knight c6, could be knight b to d7. But here, white is ready to deliver the powerful move knight takes d5, bringing the queen on a5 under attack, regaining the pawn, and developing decisive threats. After queen d8, which is the only safe square for the queen, white wins more material after simply playing knight to e5, threatening to play knight takes f6 check, and then followed by capturing on d7. The only move which even comes close to defending the position is e takes d5, but there are numerous ways for white to win after this move, the simplest being knight to c6 check, winning the queen. So it turns out that either interposition by the knight on b8 causes problems, and the other moves also do not work. If black plays knight f to d7, he will still succumb to various threats after knight takes d5, queen d8, and then bishop f4 with an unstoppable threat on the c7 square. Also, if black were to try the move king to d8, then after knight takes d5, he would actually find the queen on a5 trapped without an escape square. So it turns out that after the move queen to e2, white is threatening a 1-2-3 punch of pawn to d5, and then after the natural c takes d5, bishop b5 check, that's 2, and knight takes d5, that's 3, which is also made possible by the bishop's placement on b5 since it cuts off the rank from the queen. This tactical punch helps to explain why white is comfortable leaving the c2 pawn hanging in this position. The move bishop takes c2 also leads to disaster after the powerful move pawn to d5. Interestingly enough, the otherwise seemingly natural move knight b to d7 also encounters difficulties after the move pawn to d5, c takes d5, and knight takes d5. The exchange of pawns on d5 still gives white considerable direct tactical pressure on black's position. These situations are not immediately winning for white, but still offer excellent play, with one example line continuing queen to d8, knight takes f6 check, queen takes knight on f6, and castling queenside when black is still barred from castling thanks to the move bishop to g5, and white has a very strong threat to simply play the move bishop to b5, followed by great chances to win material, let's say because of bishop c3 or knight e5 as well. All of this helps to explain the necessity of black addressing the threat of d4 to d5, and this is why black generally plays a timely move, bishop to b4 here, leading quite often to an eventual loss of the bishop pair after castling's queenside, knight bd7, and a3. And yet, black can still claim to have a solid position with adequate development. These positions appear to offer white a slight advantage. That's all for today. I hope you've enjoyed some of the twists and turns in this video on the Scandinavian defense. We'll see you again.